Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center. And we're in the midst of the legislative session. So instead of being every other week, we'll start doing these interviews every week for the duration of the relatively short 60-day legislative session. Today, we'll be speaking with Mark Harmsworth, our Center for Small Business Director, and Pam Lewison, our Center for Agriculture Director. Real briefly, though, I want to remind you to check out WashingtonPolicy.org on our webpage for the latest of what's happening in Olympia throughout the legislative session. You'll always get great information about legislation and analysis that tells you why the legislation is important, what the impact could be on you, and what some of the alternatives may be for certain key policies. So it's a great place to go for that kind of information, especially when the coverage of state government has dropped so much in other forms of media. So be sure to go to WashingtonPolicy.org for the latest and share the information that you find there. We also have a new publication on the need for a better enforcement and better protection of First Amendment Janus rights. That's written by Elizabeth Hovde, our Center for Worker Rights and Director and Center for Healthcare Director. Her new study is there under publications at WashingtonPolicy.org, so you can see that. And then coming up fairly shortly, we'll have the launch of our policy guide, our updated policy guide, the 7th edition, where you'll be able to see give you a very broad outlook on all kinds of key policy changes that we could make in Washington State to make our state a better place to start a business, to work, to raise a family, and to have more efficient, more accountable government. So we'll be releasing that coming up very shortly as well. You can see all of this, of course, on our website and our social channels at WashingtonPolicy.org. Right now, though, I want to bring to the forefront our Center for Agriculture Director, Pam Lewison, who is off and running already with the legislative session and watching what's going on. Pam, give us an idea of the kinds of things you're expecting for this legislative session and the kinds of and some of the issues that pertain to agriculture and anything that you've seen specifically pop up so far that you're watching.
Well, I think everyone in ag is hoping for a Climate Commitment Act fix, specifically for ag fuel purchasers, because they're not supposed to be paying the tax. I also expect that we'll see a bill that will exclude H-2A workers from having to pay the long-term care tax. Because they are foreign nationals here working on a visa and they have to leave. So they've currently been charged for it unless they filled out the exemption paperwork. So this makes it something where they'd have to opt in rather than being forced in immediately upon working here. I'm also tracking, I think, a couple other bills that are really are interesting because in the case of the WRAP Act, there's 4 different versions of this bill that would ban single-use plastics or at least significantly reduce their use in the state. What's interesting about all 4 of those pieces of legislation is that none of them address food packaging and make a carve out for food packaging. And then last but not least, there is a bill in the Senate that would empower ranchers to be able to protect their livestock by shooting the first wolf who came back to a livestock kill site on their ranch.
Now, just describe that for people. I know it's a funny thing because the first time I gave a speech in northwestern Washington, I remember I thought the big issue would be taxes, but I was wrong. I mean, the big issue was wolves, and wolves. And this was many years ago. And I think it's only grown since then. But I think for a lot of people, they're divorced from that reality, the reality of the life that people lead out in extremely rural parts of the state. And, it's almost like, they're a third person watching and they don't really take the wolf situation seriously. So, when you're saying, hey, what do you mean by, them just waiting by something to kill the wolf? Why would they kill the first wolf that comes back? What's the point of it? And wouldn't that endanger the wolf population? Is what I think a lot of non-Northeast Washington people would be thinking.
Well, I think for people who are unfamiliar with it, we have 37 wolf packs. Let me clarify, we have at least 37 wolf packs in Washington state. 31 of them are located in north central and northeast Washington, where we also have a very large ranching population. So the vast majority of gray wolves in Washington state are located in a relatively small geographic area. And what we have seen is gray wolf and livestock depredations and interactions have escalated as time has gone on. Just by virtue of more wolves means, they have more desire to eat or more need to eat. And so the last report for management was in 2022. That report notes 18 head of livestock were killed and ostensibly eaten by gray wolves in Washington state. That does not account for carcasses that were dragged off or not found. It also does not account for potential death after injury to livestock in our state as well. So they represent a significant problem for the ranching population, not just in actual mortality rate, but you also have other sort of ancillary impacts where some cattle develop stress problems where they either will grow too slow or they will not mature a calf while pregnant. There's a lot more to it than just wolves are here and we need to keep them here. There needs to be some sort of management and some sort of recourse for ranchers who are impacted by them.
Yeah, I saw somebody in the chat put up a comment that the popular television series, well, the enormously popular television series Yellowstone with Kevin Costner, dealt with the wolf issue and probably, that they probably popularized that issue and made it more accessible to people than any other thing that's come along since Liam Neeson took them on, took on the gray with the ridiculous plastic bottles in his fist, So
on the one hand, I think Yellowstone has been great. On the other, I would caution people that one, it's not real life.
What?
I know, it's hard to believe. And two, and probably more importantly, wolf issues are very different based on what state you live in. So how they are managed and regulated differs between even Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. So there's very real on the ground consequences that people have to deal with. But if you're coming from, say, Wyoming, where ranchers are empowered to shoot wolves whenever they see them, whether they're killing a cow or not, in Washington state, that's something you cannot do.
Yeah, and by the way, that's more difficult than it sounds because wolves, one, are fast and you don't see them for long. They generally don't hang out. I did call one in outside of Omak at one point, in between Omak and Twisp in the mountains out there, and I did get it to hang around for a while. I was bow hunting out there, and it's jaw-dropping how huge those wild wolves are. I mean, the zoo wolves don't do any justice to that, but it's something else to see the wolves and how fast they move, and they do move fast.
Mm-hmm.
Before and I know the wolf thing has been very big in ag, but something you brought up earlier has kind of a broader context for the state, and that's the single-use plastic ban. And I think for a lot of people, they're thinking, well, wait a second, I thought we already banned these things. That's why I'm drinking out of a paper straw in some places that turns soggy by the time my drink's half done. And so what do we mean single-use plastic thing? I thought that was a done deal.
So what we're talking about, what the legislation talks about, are what are considered either non-recyclable or not reusable. So when you're talking about those sorts of things as they relate to food, you're talking about the little plastic lidded containers that your berries come in, or the bags that have holes in them when you buy your grapes. Those sorts of things are sort of on the chopping block. The problem with that is grapes are in a bag on purpose. Berries are in a clamshell box on purpose. And that's largely to keep them intact. But also it makes them easier to weigh, makes them easier to ship, and it certainly makes them more accessible to people in general because they aren't ruined while people paw through a bulk bin at a grocery store trying to get a X amount of an item.
Yeah, it's interesting how there's the trade-offs there, and I know you have a column upcoming in the Spokesman Review that people can read on this. But it's interesting because if people are thinking, well, you don't need that plastic bag, we'll just have a big vat of grapes and you pick them out like you do oranges or apples at times, and it'll all be fine. I used to pick raspberries as a kid, and we had several rows in the back, and I used to supply the restaurants downtown with berries for pies and things like that. And berries for pies are one thing; they can be mashed, even though you're not going to sell them really well if they are. But they get mashed just by you picking them. If you even stack too many on top of each other, you've got a lower quality good there. This idea that having all kinds of people picking through and being able to do that in a bulk basis, just not based in reality. I think what you'd end up seeing is, I don't know, if they couldn't come up with some kind of cardboard alternative, you're just not going to see that many berries out there.
No, well, I think what happens is you end up with more fruit
waste
and produce in particular that's either wasted or ruined. And maybe it's both. If you've ever gotten to the bottom of your clamshell and you have that 2 or 3 raspberries that are squished flat, because whether it's because the lid closed and things didn't settle right, or because they just got squished in shipping, you can imagine that, but times an infinite number if you're in some sort of bulk setting.
Yeah, and I can see that for all kinds of produce as well. It's one of those classic kinds of things where, if you ask the question one way, you can get one answer because it seems like a bad thing. But if you ask a question another way, should we make a change in packaging that increases food waste by 15%, or increases the price of fruits and vegetables so that lower income people get 30% less in their diet? Those are the kinds of trade-offs that people, don't necessarily think of when they're trying to decide on policy. Now, I know agriculture has been dealing with a lot of overtime issues, and you're probably going to end up with some property rights issues coming up, even in a short session like this. So we'll be on the watch for that. And like I say, Washington Policy on the Go is every week this week. So as things pop up, you'll learn about them fast, and you'll learn about them even faster at washingtonpolicy.org. Pam, I know you've got some kid activities to get to, and I want to thank you for coming on and sharing briefly with us today.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
You bet. All right, let's bring Mark Harmsworth, our Center for Small Business Director, up. And Mark, being a former legislator himself, sees all this as old hat. This the short session. Mark, what are you watching for this session? And is there anything that's kind of grabbed your attention or surprised you so far? Day 2, I think.
Yeah, old hat would be generous. I think clown hat may be a better approach to some of the stuff that we're seeing coming out of Olympia. There's an interesting set of bills this year. I've been primarily focused on small business, sort of taxation policy around these types of things, and a lot of the housing stuff that we're seeing coming out of Olympia. So I did want to talk about a couple of the more prominent bills that we're seeing. 2071, which is residential housing regulations. We don't think this is a good bill, but what we're always in favor of is reducing the amount of regulations that developers have on building homes to a reasonable level. I mean, you don't want to just do away with everything, obviously, but you definitely want to reduce the burden. 20-25% of the cost of a new home now is in just government permits, and so it's really driving the cost of homes up in the Puget Sound area, particularly, but also across the whole state. And that by helping in that area, would certainly reduce the cost of new homes, which is what we're after, is some more affordable housing. A really gnarly one is 2114. That is rent control. That basically puts caps on the amount of rent that a property owner can raise their rent by. And since the majority of property owners in the state of Washington are previous homeowners that have rented out their first home, what we're going to see there is a complete destruction of the rental market, which I don't know if that's the intention of the bill sponsor, but that will be the result of this, and it will not help reduce rents in any way. So we are opposed to that bill too. At least the concept of what's going on there. There's a good bill.
I thought
Yeah.
I thought the Washington State prevented, the laws in Washington State made it so that the legislature could not implement rent control. Are these all end runs around, based on technicalities then?
Yeah, things like another bill, for example, is 6064, is a pet deposit bill that prevents a certain amount of money being collected for a pet. And if you've got a 130-pound Malamute in the house, you're gonna see some damage. Carpet. I mean, my daughter has a Malamute, and they're working on their third door right now. So these are big dogs, and so when they start limiting stuff like this, it just costs too much to retrofit and refurbish a rental property. So stuff like that.
We looked at when we were looking at buying our second home, I remember, one of the houses we passed on was because the upstairs, the cats were allowed, limitless end runs around there, and the smell, I just couldn't deal with it. And I knew if you rip up the carpet, you still got the flooring underneath and all that kind of thing. And man, I think I'd rather have the Malamute than
right.
than the cats up there.
Yeah, that's for sure.
I can see that causing problems for renters.
Yeah. A couple of good ones. 5792 exempts certain size of multi-unit buildings from some of the permitting process. That will definitely help with the cost of those buildings and ultimately reduce the cost to purchase and or rent, because those are really targeted at that. A really kind of a nasty they lied to us bill is 1959. This, if you may remember, and I was in the legislature when this went through, the Paid Family Leave Act that was passed back 5-6 years ago was very heavily negotiated. In fact, Frank Chop oversaw the passage of the bill on the floor because he knew it was a very contentious bill. Part of that negotiation included an exemption for small businesses under 50 paying the employer portion of the paid family leave. Well, they're back. 1959 removes that exemption. So all of this is going to affect millions of businesses are suddenly going to have to start paying the paid family leave portion, an employee portion of that. And it's going to, for some companies, it's thousands and thousands of dollars a month. So reneging on the deal, I'm going to be writing about this one and highlighting it. Pretty gnarly way to do it, really. Negotiating good faith and then rip the rug out from underneath you once everyone's not watching, or so they thought.
I feel like there's a proverb like the scorpion and the frog here, where you see this time and again, where you've got negotiators who want something really badly, and they're pretty open about what they want ultimately, and then they negotiate something smaller, and once they have the smaller thing, there's no turning it back, right? There's no danger that they see that somebody is going to revoke that unless voters have an uprising via initiative process or something, and that's very difficult. This year we'll see a number of those of items on the ballot, probably, but this is the kind of thing where at some point you think, okay, if you're going to negotiate with the scorpion, you're going to get stopped.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sooner or later.
So. And that's basically what's going on here. So it's kind of crummy, and hopefully they will really realize what they're doing is it's just bad for. I mean, it was put in there for a reason, and this is really going to hurt a lot of our small businesses. And guess who gets to pay? Well, we do as consumers, because those small businesses are going to pass those costs on as increase in service costs or product costs and what have you. There is another bill I'm watching, which is 6024. I'm watching quite a lot of bills, but these ones particularly, promoting community transit-orientated housing development. would allow would require a municipality to rezone residential neighborhoods within 1/4 of a mile of a rapid transit route into mixed use residential. And all that blah, blah, blah that you just heard equates to you could get a Quickie Mart built next to your house if you live within 1/4 of a mile of a bus stop. And we may joke about it. And if you only have seen Grosse Pointe Blank, that's basically what could happen. Except there's no grenade and microwave and plastique involved. But that's what they're basically doing. And, around municipal cores on state highways, great. I mean, that's probably an appropriate use. And this is where I always come back to these things is where's the appropriate use? But this particular bill is the wrong way to do it. It's too far reaching, and it would enable the character of some neighborhoods, of established neighborhoods, to be significantly changed. So either this needs to be heavily amended or changed in a way that tries to keep that development within appropriate use around cores, around state routes, around highways, and not around Drury Lane, where the Beatles live. You're on mute, Dave.
Of course. I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but I get the sense that for some, there's almost an anger directed toward established neighborhoods. It's like there's an envy and a jealousy and an anger, and they shouldn't have this. Even though people are looking for single family homes all over the place, they want a place to raise their kids. They're not doesn't have to be that kind of special neighborhood. But the long-established neighborhoods are really beautiful, nice places with great parks that people come into. They aspire to be there, and so it's strange to me how often it is some of the rhetoric that comes with something like this is about forcing those neighborhoods to dissolve or to lose that character, to lose that look, which I don't even live in one, and I find that sad. I like those kinds of neighborhoods. I like seeing them, and I'm not a NIMBY kind of person where I don't want anything, but it's a weird thing how suddenly people want, hey, I'd like a superstructure so that your backyard looks like a drive-in movie theater. It's strange. Like you say, there's so many spaces that make sense for that kind of development. Yes, like in Tacoma, where I live, for example, there's huge stretches of Tacoma that it would be just fine in. But there seems to be a more of an obsession with trying to force things into places where, it doesn't fit in order to change the look and change the makeup of that. And I would think that would anger more people.
Yeah, and it's a lot of this is being driven to geek out on you a little bit here by the Growth Management Act and the Puget Sound Regional Council target population infill goals, where they won't allow cities to continue development unless they meet certain population levels. So the way you do that is increase your density or you annex areas into the counties surrounding you. But when you're a build out, like cities like Edmonds, Mukilteo, Seattle, even Everett to some degree, you can't annex anymore. So you're forced to do infill. And a lot of the cities up to this point, including the city that I live in, have used our main State Route 527 and 128th, 132nd as the infill corridors. But there's only so many apartments you can build before you have to start going into the residential neighborhoods. An alternate solution that we've been talking about now for some time is to relax the GMA boundaries, or at least relax some of the rules around how the development happens around the edge of the GMA, and which restricts where houses can be built so that we can build new houses, because we want to have a variety of homes available for folks, apartments for when that's appropriate, either when you're young or when you're old, maybe you want an apartment and not the maintenance. But in between there, you may want to raise a family or have a little more space. And so you're looking at that 3-4 bedroom suburban home with a little yard or a bigger yard if you can afford it, and be able to do that. But a lot of these rules are taking that away from people, and it drives the cost of those homes up. So on one hand, you've got the majority party saying we want affordable housing. On the other hand, they keep creating and removing affordable housing from the market or regulating it to death by making it too expensive to rent. And that's what we need to change. We need to make this thing easier to rent properties and encourage people to rent their properties when they're able to maybe move on to something else.
Yeah, it's funny how people they act as though the small differences, they'll say, well, this is only, this is only a few $100s here per thousand, or a few dollars here per thousand, or a few $100s here per 100,000. But this is on top of all these other things. I was talking the other day with somebody about how life is lived in little moments, but so are your finances, and so are taxes. These little things add up to be big things over time, and it happens. Hey, we've had a number of people asking for the bill number on the land use bill you mentioned, Mark.
The promoting community transit is 6024. It's a Senate bill with a companion 2160.
It's also interesting if you look at some of the publications and analysis provided by Charles Perstrud, our transportation director. The transit ridership has plummeted. It has not reached anywhere near the levels that they were hoping that would reach. They keep trying to force things. They're spending all kinds of money poured into it, and it's gotten priority, and yet it's not shaping up the way that others were hoping. The big change has mostly been working at home and the lack of commuting at all, which you'd think they'd be able to say, you know what, that's even better. I mean, we're saving all kinds of things. This is great. But instead, you have kind of a mindset of government types that think, no, this isn't, I had a plan here. I wanted people to be in the bus. That's what they do. They go in the bus and they go here to there. Then they get on the train and go from here to there, and instead of thinking, oh gosh, new technology has solved, has created this, massive new way for people to avoid, even going in the HOV lane to begin with, because they're just at home. Instead of being able to celebrate that, it's almost a nuisance where they're trying to figure out, well, geez, this really disrupted this central plan that we had,
Right.
which illustrates all kinds of future problems.
And I would mention many of these politicians, including my own senator, Senator Lovick, has encouraged everyone to get on the bus. I have yet to see him on the bus. So when these politicians come out and say this, it's what's good for the goose, as they say.
Well, I'm sure if we removed all the parking for legislators in Olympia and just made it public parking there, but offered, some bus passes,
Yeah, it wouldn't work.
That'd be the way to go. Yeah.
There's one last little piece of legislation that I'd like to mention, and it's illustrative of how the state will basically delegate its authority to bureaucrats. Is the thresholds for exempt and non-exempt employees. And if you are an employer, you need to be paying attention to it. Over the last few years, it's gone from around 30,000, and the target non-exempt level is 96,000. We're at 72,000 this year. And what that means is if you have an employee that works for you that works 40 hours a week, but earns less than $72,000, which is starting to include quite a lot of folks now, you have to pay them overtime. They cannot do flexi time or comp time. You have to pay them overtime for anything they do over a 40-hour week. And anything less, they don't get paid for it. You can have that as an option. But if they're salaried, that really isn't an option. So what this is doing for a lot of our nonprofits, where they receive a lot of volunteer hours from their employees, is they can no longer have them volunteer past 40 hours. And they're having to lay some folks off. It's costing one particular nonprofit here in Snohomish County several $1 million a year in additional salaries for people that just want to volunteer and help kids. So
do you know if that's gonna apply to the legislature? Because legislative staff during the legislative session work all kinds of hours over 40 hours a week. They do not get overtime. What happens is they have flex time. So that time they get it off during the summer and downtime months, because obviously a 60-day session is relatively short, but they might be working 16 hours a day, for much of that period of time, and then this time off. So I'd be curious to know if this is, while they're busy making the decisions for other people, if they're still offering the flexibility, or is this going to jack up the costs of legislative staff?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. I think it may. Interestingly enough, there is an exemption for teachers in there. So if you're a teacher, because you're working, as most of us know, teachers do work extra hours during term time. They do grading and stuff after school, but then they get some fairly extensive vacation time during the summer, Christmas holidays, and plus the midterm breaks that you see. Does that
Half days,
apply to
planning
them?
days.
Half days, yeah. So will the WEA or the National Teachers Association come in and say, okay, we want this applied to teachers now as well, in which case our cost of schooling will go up significantly because they will have their salary plus overtime during at the school year when they're doing the extra time, even though they're not working. The actual average teacher's year is about 1,280 hours, I think, once you take out all the different state vacations and the holidays. Now, again, they do work extra hours. I'm not saying they don't during term time, but things like that. And it's the point that you're making, David, for activities. You think about farm workers that maybe are in this situation where they've got harvest time and non-harvest time. It's the same issues that Pam talks about with the H2A workers as well. It's insipid the way it's doing it, and it's going up to about $96,000 over the next couple of years. So if you're not in it now, you're going to be in it pretty soon.
There's a couple of questions that have come in or comments, and I'll just see if you have anything to add to those. One from Janice. Homeowners really need to be aware if your home is near public transportation, you might want to turn the house into a sit for sale or into a group home. It almost happened in my neighborhood, but the potential buyer then pulled out because we don't have a nearby bus stop in Spokane. Property owners have no rights anymore.
Yeah, that's true. And the rules in that bill I mentioned earlier is going to make that worse.
Mixed housing typology, this is from Betsy, exists in Bellevue. Every single family neighborhood is surrounded by a buffer zone that includes townhomes, condos, fourplexes, and garden apartments. As I doorbelled, a certain demographic was convinced they needed a small mom and pop shop down the block, rather than the neighborhood center a mile away. They don't seem to understand a small mom and pop shop is a 7-Eleven because of the economies of scale that come from the national franchise model. It seems they've bought into this particular narrative, and they're insistent that Bellevue will not operate without any small mom and pop shops. How can we develop a new narrative that showcases how well the current system works and how a small business would be virtually impossible to operate on that level? Even in dense historic Seattle neighborhoods, small businesses have always existed, but they're always hanging by a thread and have regular turnover.
Yeah, the shopping model is very different. And I'm sure all of you are going to think about this and think, when do you go to the mom and pop store? You go there when you've run out of coffee or milk or bread or beer for the Husky game or whatever, or maybe not so much beer nowadays. But you go down to these stores, you pick stuff up that you forgot. When you do your big shop, you're doing that at the local Safeway where you're getting price discounts, or your local Walmart or Costco. And so it is really difficult. And I think we should allow zoning for these things. I mean, it's a free market where it's appropriate, back to my earlier comments. But it is difficult. I mean, Amazon's taking a shot at it right now with their on the go, although they've just closed a lot of their stores. We actually have one here in Mill Creek. I'd like to know how successful that is, but I know they've closed some of their stores down in Seattle, primarily I think because of crime rather than anything else. But I think you'll see stuff like that start to happen. I don't think you're ever going to get rid of the corner store. I think that'll always be there. But again, it's back to this appropriate zoning. And you as a store owner need to, and the cities need to do this when they're looking at their zoning, do the analysis on the market catchment for that area. We did something very similar in the northeast corner of Mill Creek when I was on the city council. And they were trying to build a new development which did not have the catchment, and it was going to fail. And you end up with empty buildings and whatnot. The market didn't support it at the time. It does now, but at the time it did not. So I think it's a complex issue, and absolutely solvable. And we just need to plan carefully for that zoning and make it appropriate.
There's been a number of people asking for the bill number of the exempt versus non-exempt employees.
Oh, it's a rule, and that's why it's so insipid. There's no actual bill. They've just made the rule. So go search the Department of Revenue. I think it's under exempt, non-exempt salary levels, and you'll find they've got a PDF on there, and I'm sure we can find it here and post it someplace. I've done a couple of blogs on this as well. So if you go search our site, and it shows you the graduation over the last few years for the exempt, non-exempt levels.
So what you can do is you can just go to WashingtonPolicy.org, look for a March Center, the Center for Small Business, and scroll down. Scroll down his publications on that page, and it'll lead you to this issue, and you can find out the information that you need there as well. Well, this is going to be a very busy time for the next couple of months. We'll have a lot of action in the legislature, a lot of movement. Hopefully, some people, with all these citizen movements happening right now, and affordability is still a big concern. Hopefully, there'll be some people thinking, more along the Washington Policy Center lines on accountable government, efficient government, and looking for ways to do more with less instead of ways to find more, which lead to all kinds of problems.
And I've
Mark,
just posted
yeah.
a link to the thing in our chat there if you need it for the
Oh, great.
thresholds.
Go to the chat section and you can see some of that for the schedule for salary thresholds on the overtime rules. So you can see it right there. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that. We'll be with you every week coming up on Washington Policy on the Go. So we'll check in with all of our center directors on a regular basis, depending on what the hot issue is in the legislature and their work schedules. We'll be with you every week to bring you the latest. You can watch this on YouTube, our YouTube channel, listen to it as a podcast. So there's a couple of different ways to absorb the information. And by all means, let your friends and others know about Washington Policy on the Go so they can catch up on what's happening in the legislative session every week, every Tuesday around noon. Sometimes we'll start a minute or two late. That's usually to give people some time to grab some lunch and some other things. So Washington Policy on the Go. Thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next Tuesday for another episode. Thank you.